and how the government can facilitate or obstruct market actors, and whether there's disproportionate effects on the basis of race or socioeconomic status or their protected categories. So we're excited to hear about that. So we have two presenters today. We have my colleague, Professor Angela Addae. Professor Angela Addae also has a doctorate in sociology in addition to a law degree, and is an expert on Black-owned businesses and has done a lot of funded research in that area, and is going to talk a little bit about her work in that area. And then we have Tammy Wren, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Economics and is doing some research on the government as intermediary in gun purchases, particularly as it relates to some new gun control laws here in Oregon. So we're excited to hear about that as well. So without further ado, I'm excited to hear from Professor Angela Addae. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here and listen and be in conversation with us. I'm excited to share a little bit about my work as it relates to government as intermediaries. As Professor Tippett mentioned, I focus primarily on Black-owned businesses and their interactions with the law. Particularly, I look at the intersections of race, organization, and civil rights law. So I'll be sharing a little bit about that work today. I've kind of meshed a bunch of different projects into one, so you'll hear kind of a broad overview of what I've been working on and how it all fits together. So let's start with the historical exclusion of Black-owned businesses. One thing that we do know is that historically, Black-owned businesses have been excluded from the marketplace. This has appeared and manifested in so many different forms. You can even start with slavery, right? The slavery era, people who were enslaved were prohibited from owning their own businesses. So you can just kind of imagine like people not being able to apply their own trades, people not being able to sell goods, purchase goods on their own, and all these things were indicators of not only a second-class citizenship, but also people as property. And so people who were enslaved were not able to own their own businesses, although many did, by the way. So there were a lot of people who, circumvented or in a clandestine way own their own businesses. And then similarly, during the segregation and Jim Crow era, there were strict segregation laws that were enforced in many parts of the United States, and Black-owned businesses were oftentimes relegated to certain neighborhoods. And this is, limited their access to the marketplace, their access to resources, and also their customer base as well. Redlining is another practice that involved the systemic denial of loans to Black-owned businesses, financial services to Black-owned businesses, particularly in specific neighborhoods. So if neighborhoods were deemed to be inferior for some reason, oftentimes on the basis of race of people who live there, it made it extremely difficult for Black entrepreneurs to secure funding for their businesses and also their homes. And then even as Black-owned businesses became more mainstream, they became the targets of violence and intimidation. I included a picture here from the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many of you may have heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre that happened in the Greenwood district in 1921, so over about 100 years ago. And during that time, not only were homes destroyed in the Tulsa Race Massacre, but also businesses, thriving, profitable businesses in Black commercial districts were destroyed during this massacre. And that's not the only example. Oftentimes throughout this period of racial terrorism, Black businesses were also targeted for intimidation, violence, destruction, et cetera, in order to send a message, right, about people's resistance to Black autonomy and self-determination. And then similarly, even now today, we see a lot of limited access to capital for Black businesses. Black businesses are rarely funded by venture capitalist funds, for example. So there's a lot of ways in which Black-owned businesses have their growth hindered by just the dynamics of discriminatory marketplace factors. Something interesting happened in 2020. We all are familiar with the protests that erupted after the killing of George Floyd in 2020, and there was a massive social movement that followed. This particular movement was probably one of the largest, with between 15 million and 26 million protesters responding to not only the murders of George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Eric Garner. And just the sheer response of the public to these shootings, police-involved shootings, was unprecedented. And so a lot of people focus on those protests and kind of the outcomes of those protests, but there was actually a parallel movement that was happening in response to George Floyd's death, and that was the Buy Black campaign. And so you may recall during 2020, there were lots of pleas to not only condemn state-sanctioned violence, but also support Black businesses. And so this led to tremendous support for Black-owned businesses all across the country. Customers, patrons got involved. They flooded the Black-owned restaurants, Black-owned retail shops, all in an effort to redirect dollars from large corporations to small minority-owned businesses. Now, this was something that was completely unheard of. This had never happened before, and people who were advocates for social justice saw this as an opportunity to put their money where their mouths were, and sort of, express with their dollars their values and their alignment with this movement for social justice. And there was a tremendous response, both in terms of private consumers, but also large corporations. You had online platforms such as Google and Yelp adding badges to businesses that identified as Black-owned so that customers could identify them and could connect with them. You had celebrities such as Oprah with her Oprah's Favorite Things highlighting Black-owned businesses. You had Beyonce put out a Black-owned directory. And you also had a lot of corporations get involved, corporate retailers get involved as well. So Target, for example, pledged to commit 15% of its dollars, its budget, to Black-owned vendors. And then there was something called the 15% pledge, where retailers such as Nordstrom, Macy's, Sephora, Gap, Bloomingdale's, they all committed to redirecting at least 15% of their dollars to Black-owned vendors. Target alone pledged $2 billion to Black-owned businesses by 2025, and they are on track to fulfill that goal. So here, again, this unprecedented attention to Black-owned businesses, both in 2020 and 2021, helped Black entrepreneurs gain a lot of notoriety. They secured lucrative contracts. They expanded their brick and mortar locations. They attracted investors, and there was a lot of movement and excitement about Black-owned businesses. And for the first time in history, it seemed that the eye of the public was focused on the welfare of Black-owned businesses. Here's another photo. This is the Google Black-owned badge, and this is the Target kind of announcing that they're sharing Black-owned and Black-founded brands as well. So something else happened that was interesting during this era, and that is COVID, right? So this was also during the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the economy at the time. It was an economic crisis. And so in response to both the George Floyd murder as well as the COVID pandemic, the state of Oregon adopted its own initiative, and it was called Oregon Cares Fund for Black Relief and Resiliency. And a lot of people haven't heard about this fund, but it was a very interesting initiative by the Oregon State Legislature that recognized that Black businesses, Black-led nonprofit organizations, Black families, and Black individuals were especially vulnerable during the COVID pandemic, and especially vulnerable to the negative outcomes of that pandemic, particularly because of because of historical factors that created those vulnerabilities in the first place. So the Oregon State Legislature recognized that with already existing disparities in education, economic opportunity, healthcare, that without intervention, the Black community and the Black businesses and the Black nonprofit organizations would be further harmed with the outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the fund gave 4.5% of the Oregon CARES Act funding. That's the federal funding that they received from the federal government. They gave that to these Black businesses, Black nonprofits, and it was in the form of grants and small size grants basically. So they gave about $62 million, or the fund allocated $62 million. They ended up giving about $50 million total. So this is a substantial market intervention by the government, and yet, though it had the long-term objective to foster lasting change, I find that the outcomes sort of fell flat in terms of the injection of this investment to the communities around the state. And so not only this particular program, but with the influx of support with the response to George Floyd, you would expect that the businesses in these communities would be thriving, right? Given, sold out inventories for months, and then injections by the state of investments that hope to have lasting change. But yet it rarely or barely resulted in equitable outcomes for Black businesses. And so this paper and this work in general focuses on why that is. And I basically argue that there needs to be, rather than these kind of one-off direct funding opportunities, there needs to be more systemic evaluation of the barriers that Black entrepreneurs face. And so in doing so, I have looked at a particular subset of Black-owned businesses, and that is Black entertainment establishments. So in this case, I look at the particular mechanism of liquor licensing as sort of the mechanism that guides or inhibits Black success for Black entertainment establishments, but the mechanism almost doesn't matter, right? Because there's so many different mechanisms, many of them in plain sight, that function in the same way, whether it's liquor licenses, whether it's zoning codes, whether it's parking regulations, whether it's noise ordinances. They all function in ways that can obstruct full inclusion in the marketplace for Black-owned businesses. And so in this particular subset, I look at how Black entertainment establishments operate at the intersection of these legacies of selective enforcement, meaning that they kind of get picked on by those who are enforcing liquor licenses, racialized stereotypes about who can have fun, right? What does Black joy and Black leisure look like, and why it is prevented or disrupted? And then also de jure segregation. So again, these notions of where organizations should be, who they attract, and how they should function. So I follow that with just some outline of the contemporary obstacles that entrepreneurs face for liquor licensing enforcement as well as liquor licensing administration. So what I find is that entrepreneurs have their liquor licensing applications denied at a greater rate, and so there's disparities there. And then once they receive those liquor licenses, they struggle to retain them because of the disparities in liquor license enforcement. So what that might look like, for example, is, I'm not try time. Okay. Sorry. So that what that might look like is an organization that if there's a fight at a bar, they might receive a harsher penalty, such as immediate license revocation, versus another similarly situated bar that attracts a different crowd or that plays different different genre of music. So liquor licensing from the state's point of view or state's perspective is the mechanism that is driving these inequities within Black entrepreneurship or Black entrepreneurial success. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different mechanisms at play. And then lastly, I'll mention the inaccessible civil rights claims, where in response to the discrimination that entrepreneurs face, they oftentimes and have filed federal lawsuits, federal 1983 and other civil rights claims lawsuits. And because of the framework and jurisprudence associated with those standards, it's very, very difficult for these entrepreneurs to A, get a favorable result, and B, have a favorable or even acceptable remedy. So even if entrepreneurs are able to file civil rights claims, they still cannot necessarily get the justice that they require based on their experiences of racial discrimination. So I'll pause there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So do you want to do questions now or questions at the end?
Questions at the end will be great.
Okay.
I think there's some overlap with Tammy, so.
Go ahead, Tamara, are you gonna stand there or go there? Yeah. Or camera, Jacob can move the camera wherever you wish to be.
I think I need a tape.
Great, well, we've got like 12 minutes left for questions, so who has questions? Yeah, well, so Jacob, we'll let you go first since you were performing later here. I guess I should bring you a microphone, right?
Yeah, we probably have a microphone for everybody, so when we pass it around, so.
Yeah. Is this the one, or do you have one back there that we're supposed to use?
No, that's the one.
This one, okay. All right, I'm bringing you the microphone. Here you go.
Yeah, so my question kind of, I guess both of you can kind of answer is, I know a big thing with purchasing power is credit, and that minorities, LGBTQ communities all have historically bad credit due to things like redlining or other things. And I was just wondering how you guys would, kind of fix these, or what you've seen in your studies of like maybe how we could address those issues.
Well, thanks for the question. And I think your question, though it's specific to the credit system, speaks largely to like economic inequality more broadly, and also the wealth gap is a big part of that conversation. And there's so many different ways. One is, I think community banks would actually be really influential in that. There's a book by a professor called Mirta Badaran called The Color of Money, and she talks a ton about just disparities not in the banking system, but how smaller banks have systemically been a good thing for minority communities, but also they have lacked support, and therefore they struggle because they have smaller deposits, for example, and all of the systems that are in place to sustain banks also don't sustain those types of banks. So I think support of small financial institutions, localized financial institutions that know the communities that they're serving, that are committed to developing those communities and, supporting the bankers in those communities would be a huge step forward in addressing both economic equality more broadly and also advancing what you're describing as like the credit crisis.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. No, it's interesting actually. I just read a paper on how loan applications in China, so it's not the same, can result in discrimination based off of the ethnic identity of the applicants. And what they were looking at is it can be related to just the process of going through loan applications. So maybe there's a way where you can have an intervention that you either do like blind evaluation, see if that could help, because if there's some type of bias against someone, if you hide all that information, it may lower that bias from being correlated with like loan access. And access to loans is really important, especially if you want to start like a business, you need capital, and if you can't even get a loan, then there's not much future for your economic prosperity. That's mine.
Great. Who else has a question? I saw a bunch of hands earlier. Yeah.
Professor Addae, you spoke briefly about like the response to the George Floyd incident, and it seems to me like sometimes there will be these triggering events that have a widespread response, but then that response kind of trickles off after a period of time. And I'm curious, like how we would attempt to sustain some of the positive impacts resulting from those situations.
Absolutely, thanks for that question. You're right. So basically, and I didn't get to talk about some of the numbers, but a lot of the support for Black-owned brands that spiked in 2020 have resumed to pre-2020 levels. I read a statistic that venture capital funding has decreased for Black brands by 45%. So you're right that there was just a huge spike in attention, but it was only for a moment. It was only for a moment, and it was a hopeful moment for some of us who are really excited about economic justice and see economic justice as integral to liberation more broadly. And it was a moment, I want to highlight the positives first. It was also a positive moment because never before had the broader public paid such attention to Black-owned businesses, and there was a lot of exposure and notoriety in a way that hadn't been done before. So now there are tons of Black brands in Target, and that hadn't happened before. Now there are lots of maybe Black restaurants that are more popular in their communities because of that movement. But as you observed, it wasn't sustained. And so what does it look like first of all, it's not that convenient, right? And this is more of perhaps a movement to support small and local more broadly, right? Like, what does it mean to do the work of committing to patronizing the smaller business, not ordering off of Amazon? No shade to Amazon, but what about the local bookstore in your community? And so it may be more expensive, it may be less convenient, 2-day delivery, but I think it takes a personal commitment first to kind of like invoke that lifestyle change more broadly. And then the second is, of course, you can't ignore the corporate responsibility aspect of it, right? Like these corporations are integral in our national and global economies, and what they do matters, for better or for worse. And so when I also think a lot about social entrepreneurship and how corporate social responsibility can really redirect national priorities in a way that it can uplift businesses that are typically excluded from the marketplace.
Also, thank you both for the presentation. Also for Professor Addae and piggybacking off of James' question to some extent. I followed mainly just through headlines, so I may put just in the legal analysis around this. But the Biden administration came out of the George Floyd shooting and tried to integrate a lot of racial justice policies into kind of the more macro level frameworks. And specifically speaking to like the USDA trying to relieve $4 billion worth of debt from Black-owned farmers, and then subsequently injunctions that were filed under equal protection that were then halted that type of progress for discrimination against white people or white farmers that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. So how do you think the federal government can address these issues at the macro level when there are these legal preclusions that are thwarting the advancement of some of these really large systemic barriers?
I think that question is exactly why I have a job right now, because there's no answer. So a couple of things that actually happened with the Oregon Cares Act that I pointed out earlier. So the Oregon Cares Fund for Black Resiliency and Relief was sued by the same guy that sues everybody, including Harvard. Because of those exact allegations that they intentionally, of course, it's a strategic effort. So there were there was a timber company in Eastern Oregon that applied for the fund. There was also a Latinx-owned coffee shop that applied for the fund, and both of them indicated on the application that they did not identify as Black, and their applications were denied. And so that was the basis of an equal protection lawsuit brought against the state of Oregon on those grounds. And ultimately the lawsuit settled, so we don't get juicy law out of it one way or another, but it kind of speaks to the threat of those type of initiatives. And of course, you know, the position of the court right now is such that the bar is so high for race-based legislation, even though it's not prohibited, it's just subject to strict scrutiny, and the bar is super high for strict scrutiny, that it can preclude legislation like this. What's interesting is that now, knowing this, state legislatures and other policymakers are finding really creative ways to target the communities that they're interested in getting direct funds to without using race. And sometimes they use proxies for race. Sometimes, for example, in the IRA that just recently was passed, there's attention to climate impacted communities. You know, there's attention to organizations that are culturally responsive and culturally specific, that engage in certain kinds of work. So there are different ways in which policymakers are sort of tiptoeing around the sensitive issue of race one way or another. And I mean, it speaks to a broader conversation about whether or not we should be considered racist and in what capacity, right? So I don't think that conversation is going to end anytime soon, but it has been interesting to see the creative ways in which policymakers across the country have navigated using just different categories, right? That may be also colored by race, but are not the protected category of race itself.
So then that would just be subject to a rational basis.
Looks like we're out of time, so let's thank our panelists.